Hello, everyone. Welcome to Home with Isha Sesay. We know that everyone has so much going on. We wanted to give you another chance to catch some of our best interviews from the last few days. Enjoy. We have Joey Jackson here with us today to go through all that is happening in the news. Specifically, we want to focus on the George Floyd case, which has sparked these protests, not just here in the United States, but around the world, and talk about the road ahead for a successful prosecution and what the challenges may be, and then pull the lens out to look more specifically at the criminal justice system. Joey Jackson is here. He joins us from New York. Joey, my friend, welcome.
It is so good to be with you. You do such a tremendous job and perform such a tremendous service for people throughout the world. So it's an honor to be here with you.
Thank you, Joey. It is enormously kind of you to say that. We are tremendously fortunate to have you with us to really try and get to grips with this moment and to really fully understand the legal road ahead, and for you to put it in context from your many years working in this field as to just why things are the way they are and how they have to change. So let's start with this George Floyd case, and we all know that all the officers involved have been charged. We know that Derek Chauvin, his charges were upgraded. Initially it was third-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter, upgraded to second-degree murder, and the other three officers, Alexander Kung, Thomas Lane, Tutau, all being charged. And yet we heard from the Attorney General Keith Ellison say, basically, this is not a slam dunk. You know, this is still a difficult road that lies ahead. And I think it would be very helpful to hear from you why this isn't a slam dunk, or why people are saying there are evidentiary difficulties here.
So there's so much happening, and just to put everything in context, George Floyd is the case that we're referring to, but George Floyd is systematic and problematic of a much larger policing issue throughout the country. And so, yes, it was George Floyd this time. Prior to that, it's Eric Gardner. After that, it's Philando Castile. It's Sterling. It's just so many. And so what people need to understand is that this is not an isolated event in which people throughout our country just decided, based upon this limited issue, to start protesting and it getting, rioting to happen and cities just to ignite. This is systemic of such a broad issue. And I think this just really brought it to the fore. And I know your question is a lot more specific than that, but I think it's important that people understand the context of why people are so upset, so infuriated, and something needs to be done. We are at a critical time in our history right now with regard to America. What we do moving forward, what happened here, how is it allowed to happen, why would it be problematic for prosecution moving forward? And so in starting the conversation, it's imperative that people understand that this was just a powder keg waiting to explode, and enough is enough because of what people saw before their eyes. And we know, Aisha, what that was. We saw the murder of someone, essentially, we looked at it and we saw it on video in disbelief. How could it be that an officer can have their knee on someone's neck for almost 9 minutes? 3 of those minutes upon which the person was unconscious. How could that possibly happen? It's part of a larger and broader problem involving the over-aggressing policing in communities of color. And it's been an issue not only in Minnesota, let's be clear, it's been an issue in New York. It's been an issue in New Jersey. It's been an issue, in Los Angeles. It's been an issue everywhere. And so this is just systematic of what people are enduring. And now's the time for reform. So, to your question, the issue now is that you mentioned all the degrees of murder he's been charged with. Let's just back up for 1 second, and please stop me if you need to, ask me to further clarify things if you need to, but everyone needs to understand. The problem people had was that they witnessed this murder right before their eyes and there was no arrest. And it begged the question of why would there not be an arrest? And let me just be clear. If a citizen does something in this country that is deemed to be criminal and there's reason to believe that a crime was committed, they're arrested. That's the standard. Is there reason to believe a crime occurred? I don't think there's any person that has a pulse that looked at that tape that didn't get the feeling that there was reason to believe that a crime occurred. Now, we can debate whether it was a crime, wasn't a crime, the degree to which it is a crime, first degree, second degree, third degree, all of which I'll explain. But I think people had a gut feeling that something was wrong. So if I did something like that, I'd be arrested immediately. If you did something like that, immediate. And not any other citizen, immediate. Why is it that
Let me jump in there, because Joel Cohen, a former state and federal prosecutor, wrote for law.com essentially a piece that said he felt that it was pressure from the street and the community that forced, as far as he was concerned, a rush to charge these individuals, and saying that he felt that it was dangerous to be in a situation where the street and the community and newspaper editorialists are dictating the timing of a prosecutor's charging decisions. I mean, I found that staggering to read. I mean, put that in context. Did you feel that there was undue pressure and in the way this thing was playing out?
Here's how I feel. I feel that there are so many attorneys in the country and everyone is entitled to their opinion and everyone is entitled to state their opinion with respect to what they see, observe, pressure, no pressure. So in terms of Mr. Cohen, we just have a principal disagreement.
Joey, as you speak about it wouldn't happen to any other person who was caught on camera, on tape, holding another person down and snuffing the life out of them. As you talk about the differences, I just want to get your reaction to the fact that after that tape was released, there was, I don't know if it was that same night or certainly a few nights after, before Derek Chauvin was taken into custody, there's the image of 75 police officers clad in black and armed and seemingly clad like riot police, but I can't speak to that, but certainly clad in black, blocking off the road to his home. It's seemingly protecting his home from the community. What message does that send to the wider community and to this country to see 75 police officers standing, protecting the home of a man caught on camera incontrovertibly with his knee on the neck of someone till they died? What does that say about policing in this country? What does that say to you about the message that sends?
I think it's a horrific message. Who are you protecting? Shouldn't you be protecting citizens that are falling dead, particularly people of color who are young and black, who are falling dead at the hands of police, as opposed to the person responsible for engaging in the misconduct to begin with? And let me just make absolutely clear what my position is. We have officers out there who are doing their job every day and twice on Sunday. I salute you, who are protecting communities, who are respecting communities, who are courteous to people who they're arresting and who are interacting with communities in a favorable way. Let me also tell you that my father was a police officer, may he rest in peace, and I get and understand what they're going through. That's not the point. The point is that in the event that there's someone that steps out of line, we have an obligation to say so. If you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And if someone does something wrong, we shouldn't be protecting them. We should be saying it's wrong. We should be calling it out. We should be bringing them to justice. We should be getting justice for the people that they exact this injustice upon. And so where's the protection for the communities? Where are the people who are police officers dressed in black protecting them? I'm not castigating the entirety of law enforcement. I'm telling law enforcement that if one of your own does something wrong, you have an obligation to do something about it. it. You have an obligation to say something about it. You have an obligation to address it. And if you don't address it, you know what? It makes it worse. And that's why we're seeing the reaction we're seeing across the country with protesters saying we are mad as heck and we are not going to take it anymore. Enough is enough. And unless communities are respected, unless communities are policed appropriately, unless you have officers in communities who reflect the communities they serve, who are trained to understand those communities and who are engaging in force where it's appropriate, not inappropriate, it's going to get worse. And that's why we're in this position now, and it's a shame.
So let me ask you this. You said something that was very important about the responsibility of fellow officers when they see one of their own stepping out of line, that they have a responsibility. Is there not something on the books that stipulates that there's a legal duty to intervene?
You have a legal, professional, moral, ethical responsibility to do your job. We're hearing claims about an officer was only on the job for 4 days. This officer was only on the job for 3 shifts. What does that have to do with it? The fact is that you have a legal duty and obligation to actually prevent a fellow officer from killing someone. What about that?
Have we seen people move? Have attorneys, district attorneys, have they moved on that to prosecute people for failing to intervene? I mean, how widely enforced is that? Because I'm reading that Minneapolis is only now moving to ensure that that is enforced, that legal duty of fellow officers to intervene in the case of extreme or disproportionate force.
The answer is that it's not enforced at all. We have a tough enough problem in this country enforcing issues relating to the police officer himself or herself exacting all types of criminality onto someone, much less those standing around them. The problem is twofold. Twofold is the problem. One is an accountability issue. We can go back to Eric Gardner, right? And we can go back to Eric Gardner, I believe it was in 6 years ago, okay? 2014, Eric Gardner, he gets killed. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. He's dead. The officer is not even indicted. What does an indictment mean? Just so that everyone's clear. An indictment means that there's a group of people, usually 23, it varies by every state. They get together and they convene, and a majority, that's 12, right? And that varies by jurisdiction too, decide that there's enough evidence to take the case to trial. They couldn't even get an indictment on Eric Gardner, and as it related to Eric Gardner's death by Officer Pantaleo, who killed him. And so if we're not going to get an indictment, that is the district attorney convening with a grand jury to say there's enough to go to trial, how else are we going to get accountability? You had, let's fast forward, right? And then you have the Department of Justice who investigates for 5 years. 5 years. And then they say, oh, you know what? We're not moving forward. How's that accountability? And so if we're not holding the people, to your core question, Isha, we're not holding the people who are doing the violence responsible, how on earth do the people who are standing by think that they're going to be held accountable?
Joe Jackson, we feel so incredibly blessed and fortunate to have had an hour with you. Thank you for being so generous with your time and always being so kind to me. Thank you. Thank you for answering all the questions. And we look forward to welcoming you back again soon. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you, Isha. God bless you.
The killing of George Floyd it's dominating all our thoughts, understandably, and is prompting many important conversations. We've seen the people out in the streets. We've seen the calls for change. But the sad reality is it's not the first time that we've had to grapple with this issue of unarmed Black people being killed by police here in the United States. We have been here before. Sadly, it is not a rare occurrence. Let me give you some context now. According to the Washington Post, in 2019 alone, 1,028 people were killed by police in the United States. Now, half of those people were white. But here's the context that you need to bear in mind. Half of the people were white, but African Americans, Black people only make up about 13% of the US population. So we are being killed in disproportionate numbers, double the number of white people who are losing their lives at the hands of police officers. And the same goes for Hispanic Americans. There is something very wrong in the interactions between law enforcement and Black people here in the United States. In some parts of this country, being killed by police is a leading cause of death for Black men. we want to grapple with this, and we have the perfect person. Rashada Robinson is president of Color of Change, which is an online racial justice organization that's playing a critical role in catalyzing change in this much needed moment. And he joins us now from New York. Rashad, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's good to see you.
It's good to see you too. Listen, I know that the George Floyd Memorial is happening right now. Also know that those 3 police officers who were taken into custody and charged yesterday will be in court on this Thursday. Are you more hopeful today than you were yesterday about the situation?
I don't know if hopeful is the right word. I am, I think that it was important that we get to the point where these officers were arrested, but at the end of the day, we have a long way to go. We have watched officers get arrested before and go to trial and not actually suffer any consequences as a result. There's a couple of things that are at play, and I think hopefully people will recognize. One, police officers have a whole set of rules when they go into court on these cases that the rest of the public doesn't have. From sort of the very start of when someone is killed by a police officer and how information is shared and how they are able to deal with their police union, to all sorts of other immunity. The standard is very, very high for a police officer to face consequences, regardless of video, regardless of how much sort of we know. And time again, juries let police officers off because you simply need one person. You need reasonable doubt, which is not a standard that I'm going to push back on. But in a country that has deep levels of racial challenges, you set up a jury, you make the victim the enemy, you make the victim the problem, and then you get that one person to say, I don't know, maybe the police officer had a reason, and then the police officer gets off. And so I'm not hopeful. What I am hopeful about, which is not about the arrest, what I am hopeful about is what we're seeing out in this country right now in terms of people standing up and demanding something new, pushing for changes that are well beyond the type of things that people were willing to push for just weeks earlier, and recognizing all of the ways in which simple and short solutions will not get us to where we need to go as a country.
And so that being said, the difficulties in getting these officers prosecuted and getting them to pay penalties, what is your position on these protests continuing? I mean, where do you stand on that?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, people ask me about the protest, and I think the protests actually have to do with a lot of things, in my opinion, right? Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and then we had George Floyd, and all of those things happening so close to one another. But we also have a kind of a challenge that we've been dealing with as America's disinvestment, America's exploitation, attack on Black communities left us deeply exposed as the coronavirus rushed across the country and killing Black people at much higher rates, while we were also being tasked with overwhelmingly being essential workers in a lot of places. We were watching white men with guns show up to capitals, demanding people go back to work, actually in many ways demanding Black and brown people go back to work and facing no consequences whatsoever. And then you had these sort of killing after killing, and in each killing, watching folks on TV, watching folks in the larger public kind of explain away why there might have been a reason for it to happen, why that death was justified, that killing was justified. And so people had had enough. And so I think it's important for folks to know that you don't get to this level of uprising just on one incident alone. People are reacting to years, decades, hundreds of years, really, of oppression, and are recognizing that all of the ways, all the things we've been told about how to make change, you go to the polls, you elect an official, you get them to do things. Yes, vote. Yes, do those things, but people are recognizing all the ways in which that is just insufficient in and of itself, because folks have been voting, folks have been turning out, folks have been doing those things, and we recognize all the ways in which the system sort of aligns to prevent real progress.
And so clearly something has to be done differently, is basically what we're saying. You can't keep having the same response to the problem. The processes are ongoing, but what else? What do you layer on top of that? President Obama spoke yesterday, and it was much needed. Many people talked about that. Your thoughts on what President Obama brought to this moment?
Yeah. So I thought it was important. First of all, I was really honored that President Obama asked me to be one of the 3 speakers after be on the panel. And so, that was an honor. And, the thing about President Obama, which I think is important to state, is that, look, I definitely met with the president a number of times on criminal justice during his administration, but me and my organization also stood outside the White House sometimes and brought petitions and challenged and made demands and sometimes really pushed in ways where we weren't always on the same page. And so, the ways that democracy works is that elected officials and people in power have to be responsive to folks, regardless if you're sort of fully in favor with those in power. The idea that on one hand you have a president of the United States turning hoses on peaceful protesters, and on the other hand you have President Obama willing to have folks that have been critical of him on various issues sit around the table and talk about issues. It's a completely different change in terms of how change happens. So just the sort of cultural dynamics of the day is important. Mm-hmm. I guess the other thing that I think was important was to sit and listen to someone that really knew what they were talking about, that really had studied the issue, that sort of had a deep level of knowledge of the intricacies. I mean, I knew this when I went to the White House years ago after Philando Castile, Alton Sterling, and those Dallas police officers were killed. And he brought us sort of all to the White House and had us sitting around a table. And it was really incredible to watch the president sort of lead the whole meeting. There was no staff sitting next to him. He was calling on people, pushing back on things, asking for numbers. And it was just such a command of information. And the thing about that meeting was that during that meeting, the head of the Fraternal Order of Police said something actually directly to me around, I was talking about racial profiling. And he said that all of this talk of racial profiling is new to him. All of the talk of racial profiling is new to him. And, it's not that he was saying, I don't agree with your demands around ending racial profiling. He didn't say, I think you might be overstating racial profiling. He was basically saying it doesn't exist. He was gaslighting us. And so part of what I really appreciated from President Obama was that he did talk about sort of the barriers in our way of making progress. And as a person who held the highest position, the most powerful position in the land, he gave a lot of weight to the power of protest, the power of organizing, the power of everyday people pushing for change. Sometimes politicians will say, just vote. But President Obama also said, vote and show up and raise your voice. And I think that that's incredibly important because we need to hear that. Folks that maybe haven't yet joined us need to hear that from our leaders. Because they need to know that that change actually takes a lot more work than sometimes we're told.
Yeah. Which I want to say, it was so good to have you on the show. I hope you'll come back. We want to spend more time with you and really spotlight just the scale of the issue, the depth of the issue, the people who are working on this issue and have been working long before this moment. And we'd just like to share that with our viewers. So we thank you for today, and we thank you in advance when we bring you back.
Look forward to it. Talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon. Be safe. What happened to George Floyd was a sad reminder of a reality that thousands and tens of thousands, millions of people can speak to here. The differences in policing and the way the courts treat Black and brown people, it's almost as if, in fact, some would say that there are two systems at play here in this country. One system for white people and one system for Black and brown people. And Black people are disproportionately treated harshly by both those systems. When it comes to policing, many again point to the origins of policing in this country, that you can take it all the way back to the slave patrols that were formed to catch runaway slaves, to keep them in place, and that it is that trend of violence that we see today and that has infected much of the institution of law enforcement here in the United States. But how do you grapple with change? What does change look like? We're talking about policing, criminal justice, and we're talking about most institutions here in the United States. What does change look like? What is the right kind of change to be calling for? Thankfully, we have someone who's been working in this space for a very long time and has given a lot of thought to these issues. Marcus Glover is the board chair of Defy Ventures and also the founding partner of a private equity firm called M. Glover Capital. They're catalyzing change through social impact investments. And Marcus also works with those who have emerged from prison, those who've been released, working at getting them a second chance, helping them fully reintegrate into society. He has many thoughts on all of this, and I'm pleased to say he joins me now from New York. Marcus, welcome.
Thank you, Aisha. So good to see you.
So good to see you too. An important day to have you with us. You've no doubt been looking at all these scenes playing out following the killing of George Floyd. You've seen the people take to the streets. You've heard people call for justice and demand reform. You know, reform, it's a big word. It means a lot. But for you, when you look at the system and knowing the scale of the problem, let's take an overview of your thoughts on the chances of success. I mean, where do we begin?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's a really magnificent moment. I think we're all watching history unfold. And while the magnitude of the Black Lives Matter protests are taking fold, I like to look at it even more basic. You know, sometimes Black Lives Matter feels big and, you know, just sort of an unattainable reality. Really what we're talking about is Black living matters, right? We're just talking about being an African American, going to Central Park, asking someone to put their dog on a leash, and weaponized racism allows you to use, you know, the paramilitary apparatus of police to threaten the lives of Black people, right? So Black people are confronted with this reality every day. I say to my friends of other races, at 16 years old, you were giving your son or daughter a bar mitzvah, a bat mitzvah, a quinceañera. I was teaching my children how to get arrested without getting killed. And so we see this double standard play out in everyday living as Black Americans. So when we start to look at what's being currently debated in the halls of Congress, a bill that would start to really look at, I honestly think these are very rudimentary ideas, like a national registry for police, a Yelp for police, which will just kind of be able to take a badge number and look up and see if these are bad apples. These seem like such basic things, but we know that the arc of justice is long and we need to start somewhere. So I'm encouraged.
It's good to hear you say that you're encouraged. I mean, amongst the other things that were in that bill that was proposed by the Democrats a short time ago, banning chokehold and no-knock warrants in drug cases, ending racial profiling. Again, this is stuff that it's hard to believe that in 2020 it has to be put into a law once more, that it's still up for debate, that police departments up and down this country are still doing this kind of thing. Explain to me your thoughts on why it has been so difficult to reform policing and law enforcement here in the United States.
Well, sure. I mean, I think it's pretty well documented. I think your audience, do a really quick Google search and you'll see when you look at over-policing and violent policing in communities of color, it's been sort of a death by paper cuts, right? It sort of starts with the tough on crime passage of bills in the Congress that leads to this, militarized force of policing around the country. It begins to start to create union pressure and enormous union donations to the point where police captains, mayors don't even have the authority to root out bad apples. They can't even fire them. So it's this confluence of things over time, which we know this is what systemic racism really means. It's an animal that just grows in power and strength over time. And so today we have this even person in the White House, we'll put it, who says he's the law and order president. And really when you break that down, it's not the law component, it's the order. Mm-hmm. Where's the order in the Constitution, right? Mm-hmm. It doesn't exist because it's completely biased based on, I perceive this community to be out of order, and I can use the apparatus of the state in order to put resources, the paramilitary police force, the judicial killings that happen of Black people. And this is all taxpayer funded. So, again, it's a mire situation that we just need to be able to start somewhere. So again, I do feel encouraged about what is being debated.
So where do you stand on these calls to defund the police? I mean, what's your thought on that? Are we talking about, in fact, there are two schools of thought. There's defund the police, and then there's talk of do away with police departments as they stand right now completely and replace them with these community-led safety initiatives. Where do you stand?
Sure. Well, I think that the defund, I've talked to many friends, I'm sure you have as well. It's scaring a lot of people, and I think it can be demystified a bit. I don't think most people are calling for the outright abolition of police force. I am a prison abolitionist. I believe prisons and jails should be completely discarded and destroyed. I think that they are the grandchildren of the plantation system. However, I do think that there needs to be some method of community safety, but we don't need the paramilitary force. So I think more people are saying, if you shift resources at the same time that programs that would help with prevention and help with, just alternatives to incarceration and alternatives to the punitive measures of the court, if you fund more of those, then you might have a little less reliance on the police. Yeah. So I think it's not entirely a defund as much as shift resources.
And when we talk about, the prison system, you've talked about your prison abolitionist. Talk to me about your feelings there, where we see Black people get, disproportionately longer sentences for the same crimes that a white person may have committed, disproportionate numbers of Black people being sentenced, to begin with, arrested to begin with, sentenced, thereafter. How do we fix that? And I ask this specifically in light of something which is that this administration has appointed a glut of conservative judges to the benches. How do we change that in this atmosphere, in this time?
Right. So thanks for the question, Aisha. It's funny because you said the word, how do we fix it? And you've heard the meme, the cliche that it's actually already fixed because this is what it was designed to do. The reality is that prisons and jails, it's an $80 billion a year business, right? So that's really big business. As a person in private equity, I think of companies with a market cap of $80 billion. So you look at whatever, like an Amazon or Facebook. Now think about if an Amazon, an $80 billion a year market cap, if 70% of things you bought on Amazon were defective merchandise, right? You would call that a failed company, right? So in our prisons and jails, in our system of corrections, 70% of people will recidivate, meaning they'll come back to jail. So what you really understand is that this is a system that's been designed as a revolving door for wealth and profit of those few. Yeah. And that is what has been weaponized against Black people and brown people since the beginning of time. So I think, I don't think you need to be a scholar or a scientist to just look at the numbers and do the math and see that this is weaponized against us.
So in a way, there is no fixing because you just have to get rid of it is essentially how you've come to this position.
Yeah. And again, I don't want to scare your audience. I think that at the same time that we can abolish it, we can be building models that exist that offer alternatives to incarceration, right? So personally, I do a fair amount of volunteer work in prisons and jails at Rikers prisons and other places. And I work with juveniles, so 15 to 19-year-olds. And I swear to you, in the 5 years that I've been working, I've never met one person that I actually thought belonged in jail, right? They need therapy, they need mentorship, they need higher learning. but I fail to see how sitting in a 10 by 10 box is either corrective for society or improving the bottom line of their lives. So, society-wide, we're looking at a system, it's called corrections, and yet it doesn't do nearly anything about that.
And then you have, the forces that you have, in power right now. And, when it comes to just policing, the National Security Advisor saying there is no systemic racism in law enforcement. And,
once again, I feel like a lot of the national talking heads, they provide these pretty ridiculous talking points. Fortunately, so much of change in America is local. It's working with local mayors, electing the right DAs that are saying, this is stupid. I'm not going to charge this young kid for, graffitiing on a wall. Like, he needs to go to art school, right? So it is important. And we hear this time and time again. It really is crucial that we all get involved on the local level, so that we can really begin to implement change. As you said at the beginning of your broadcast, they the party in power, have been systematically putting their judges, the most conservative judges, in record numbers because they recognize the power of the bench. And so we've got, at the same time, a fight for 1600 Avenue, or as I like to say, Black Lives Matter Plaza. We still have to work on the local level to make sure these programs will create change.
Yeah, we definitely do. Marcus Glover, it's good to hear from you and for you to share your perspectives. I hope you'll come back and talk to us again soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marcus. Be safe. Take care.
Bye.
Here in the United States, there are two pandemics at play. There is COVID-19, which we've talked a lot about openly and for many, many days. And there's also another disease that is running rampant, and it is that of racism, white supremacy. It is about the systematic discrimination of Black and brown people here in this country. COVID, again, appeared on our radars towards the end of last year, fully taking center stage this January. But that other disease of racism and the harming of Black people, that is centuries old here in the United States and dates back before the formal acknowledgement or birth of this country. So how do you deal with it? How do you dismantle something like that has seeped into the thoughts and bloodstream and the culture of a place? And how do you heal from the pain that has been caused by it? We have a very learned individual here to help us grapple with these questions now. Dana E. Crawford is a psychologist and the founder of the Crawford Bias Reduction Theory and Training. She joins us now from Maryland. Dr. Crawford, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for using your platform to give voice to this pandemic that's racism.
Thank you. Thank you for doing this. This is an important conversation. Let me ask you, first of all, what you've made of the last almost 2 weeks now, following the emergence of that video of George Floyd being killed on a Minneapolis street. There is so much pain, so much anguish that I've seen and felt. What stands out for you when you look at the reaction from the Black community here in the United States?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. None of these images are new. What is new is that we have now the technology to prove the things that we've been saying, not for years, not for a decade, but for centuries, right? And so that's very clear. But what is unique in this moment is that the entire world has been on pause. Outside has been closed. And so with COVID, it created this perfect storm of proof that we've had and the attention to actually dissect and lean into that proof. And so I think what has happened in terms of the response from Black folks and how we've navigated is now we have our proof. And we're exhausted and we're tired, but we're not too tired to say, look, we told you this is what we're going through. And I'm seeing my white brothers and sisters and non-binary siblings recognize that because now they have the time to pay attention.
With the video, as you said, the reality of the violence wrought on Black and brown people in this country is known, and Black people can speak freely of it across generations in families, right? And with this video, once more, we saw this kind of outpouring and the sharing of people's experiences. Sharing is good, talking is important, and I know someone like yourself in your field would say that people need to talk and get it out. But have you had any concern in this moment that with all this talking, there is a re-traumatizing that is taking place?
Of course, I dare not say re-traumatizing for some people. I think folks that are new to understanding this pandemic, they are receiving their first level of trauma. I think for us, we have generations of trauma. The epigenetics, this is how your DNA changes due to trauma. I have epigenetic trauma from my great-great-great-great-great-grandmother. But I think for folks that this is new for them, absolutely, watching a recorded murder over and over again is highly traumatizing. I actually think that it is not healthy for people to rewatch these images with a multitasking approach. So you're looking at your phone and you're cooking dinner and you're watching these images. Instead, in the same way that when we do the Pledge of Allegiance, there is a pause, there is a stop, the entire energy around stops. That is how these videos should be viewed. There should be forewarning. Everyone should sit, brace themselves, and then watch it. When I chose to watch the video, I knew in the morning, I'm going to watch this video tonight. All day long, I did some self-care, and then I picked the time that I would watch it where my house was quiet. I grabbed a beverage and I processed it. And then afterwards, I engaged in some self-care. So sometimes I think for Black people, we are very skilled at keeping it moving. We don't let trauma slow us down, or we wouldn't do the things that we've done. But right now, what I'm inviting us to do is to actually feel what we're experiencing, process it, and then reflect on what are some healthy next steps that will help us heal from this pandemic that is racism.
The video aside, the day-to-day experiences for so many Black people in this country is one of microaggressions and some far greater obvious displays of violence and discrimination due to our skin color. What you mentioned epigenetics just then. What does that do to one's sense of self, one's ability to be healthy, to form healthy relationships, to build a healthy community? What is the impact of that accumulation of, abuse, really?
Actually, yes, you're absolutely right. When you summarize, of all of that, it's abuse. And so it does a couple of things. The first thing on an epigenetic level is we start to transmit, our DNA changes, and we have trauma in our DNA. But the other thing that it does is it causes inflammation. It causes fatigue. The old adage, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. Microaggressions are coined death by 1,000 paper cuts. But the flip side of that is it builds resiliency. I think that we're some of the strongest beings on this planet. I saw a video that it said, thank goodness Black people want equality and not revenge. I think that we have, lived in spaces and ways that we've had to learn higher and more evolved ways of forgiving and being able to still engage people that have said ridiculous things to us in the workplace, from our friends to our relatives, all of the things we've had to deal with. And yet we are resilient. But I think it's important that if we're building resiliency, we take the time to pause and have self-care. In this world that attacks the Black body, self-care is activism, is a revolutionary act. And I invite Black folks for us to take care of ourselves. If you need a nap, take yourself a nap. If you need to put some cream on your face and do a manicure, do a manicure. Like that, taking care of the Black body is revolutionary these days. And so I invite us to do that and then focus on resiliency.
Yeah. We are the victims and infected by this racism, right? It infects us, it causes us harm, but the perpetrators are also infected.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a moral violation. It's a human violation. That's why it's a pandemic. It's not a Black problem. And the reality is, Black people, we're very multicultural and multiracial. You know, it's not, I don't think anyone these days doesn't have another member of their family that is from a different race, a different ethnic group. Our children are different shades than us. And so this is a human condition. And I think for white folks, and I don't want to just lean the conversation into white and Black, there are brown, Black, tan, yellow folks that are also part of this conversation, and anti-Blackness is present in all spaces. And the reality of this is when you have racism towards someone, you have a prejudgment, you have a bias towards someone, and you act on that, and you are striving to be a good person in this world, it's a moral violation. And that moral violation, for some people, they lean into guilt and they check out. What I invite you to do is have the courage to know that if you live in a privileged body, no one is killing you because of the body you live in. And so the very least you could do is to acknowledge your guilt and engage in some action steps to systematically reduce your bias, prejudice, and racism. And that's what the Crawford Bias Reduction Model is.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, so it's 3 steps. It's about awareness. And that's what we all know. If you've gone to any multicultural, read a diversity book, read an article, you know about awareness. That's the critical piece. But then once you know, the next piece is doing an investigation to understand what triggers your racism, bias, and prejudice. And then how does it show up in the world? When you have racism, prejudice, and bias, do you become really withdrawn and pretend like it doesn't happen and you lean into the myth of equality because all things are not equal, things are not fair all the time? Or do you become really superhero mode and you're trying to rescue people and you're overcompensating and you're texting all your Black friends and you're asking them, can you buy them dinner? Or are you moving against and you're leaning so much into the particularities of protesting and you're calling it rioting as if you forgot the Boston Tea Party existed and the foundations of this country. And so that's how it may manifest. The next piece is leaning into reducing. So it's awareness, investigation, and reducing your bias and the impact. The reducing part is called let up. And the let up is listening to what triggers you, empathizing, not with someone else, but with your own pain. So you can be empathetic to someone else and then telling your story. What is your journey? Then it's understanding the larger context. And lastly, providing education, psychoeducation, that's the up part, realizing that you do not collude with racism, prejudice, or bias, and you are making a stance. I am an anti-racist. In any places that racism shows up, I got some beef for racism. I'm going to say no racism. You are not allowed here. And that's what it means to really reduce your bias, racism, and prejudice.
I mean, it's fascinating to hear you lay it out like that. Does it work?
Yeah. So how does one evaluate if it works? Do I think that people become less racist? Absolutely. Do I think that racism eradicates? No, because racism always defends itself. It's very clever. And I think about the world pre and post 9/11, if you need an example of how racism creates new ways of being. You know, when I was a kid, it wasn't prejudice and bias towards transgender folks. And now there's a whole new field, you know, and I guarantee when my children grow up, there will be a whole new group of people or new way of viewing people and a new racism to fight. And so it becomes really critical that we're thinking about ways to reduce it.
You mentioned children, so I want to pick up on that. How should parents, Black and white, brown, in between, how should they be using this moment? This moment where we have these images out there, this moment where there is the conversation and where there is such a public expression of pain and anguish and violence as well that we have also seen. How should parents be responding to this moment with their children?
So they need to be leaning in and having these conversations. And I think a really short, succinct way is saying, we live in a world where a lot of people are having this infection that is called racism. It's bullying. And some people didn't know it was happening. And now more people are realizing that people are being bullied because of the skin and the body they live in. In this family, we do not tolerate that. And we speak up for people who need to have a voice in the world, because we're lucky that some people gave us a voice, even though we maybe didn't earn that voice. And so we're going to use our voice to help people. And so I think it's really important that we lean in and make definitive statements about racism is not right. And it's not a soft statement. It's very clear, just like you would tell your child, go to bed. It wouldn't be a soft statement. It's very firm.
Such a fascinating conversation. Dr. Crawford, so grateful for your time. Thank you. I know we'll have you back in the days ahead and the weeks ahead, because this is a conversation that must go on. So thank you for today.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
You too. Take care. You are a human rights lawyer. In the past, you held a position as a UN Special Rapporteur on the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and of association. You made a visit to the United States in 2016, and amongst the things you said is that you call the country a nation of struggle and resilience. Talk to me about your sense of the country today as you look at the protests and all that has sparked this moment and people taking the streets.
Well, it seems to me that the U.S. has been caught up, and historically, with what people like to call the original sin, which was the sin of racism, the sin of slavery, the sin of segregation, and that struggle to fight that has continued and has been consistent since the 1700s. So it's gone on and on since the first African was brought to the U.S. 400 years ago. So it's that resilience that you see. And looking at the protests even now, and there's this wonderful clip that's been going around the internet where they show all the cities, a lot of the cities coming in. You see a lot of people, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. That resilience, that anger, that determination to try and create change is what is the resilience in this country. But the contradictions within the US and what the US is about have been highlighted definitely by the coronavirus, and then by the killings of people of color, especially by the police. And again, it's not new. I mean, this was going on even in the Obama time. When I came here in 2016 on mission to the US, it was around that issue of corona, around killings of Black people. The things happened in Ferguson, especially in Baltimore. And I went to all those cities, and it was that sense where the police were resisting the idea of Black people coming together and fighting for change. And the fact that Black Lives Matter started during Obama's time is also quite instructive of the fact that despite the fact you had a Black head of state, there was still a lot of structural and institutional racism that was affecting the lives of Black people. So that struggle continues, and Black people have historically been quite strong in this country and in fighting back, in resisting, in trying to organize and push back. And it's wonderful to see so many young people out there, who are going out and saying, we've got to have this change. We've got to stop this. It's been wonderful to see that.
And I wonder what you make of the fact that, despite the constitutionally given right to assembly here or constitutionally protected right to assembly here in the United States, you've had the kinds of comments that have come out of the White House in recent days. I wonder what you make of that and what it says about the necessity of the right kind of leadership in a moment of crisis.
Isha, as an African, what I see here is very familiar. It's what we grew up with in Africa.
We all
know it. Absolutely. We have all got these stories about seeing. Yesterday, I went out near the White House to see what was going on, and you see this lines and lines of security. And my first thought was that, my goodness, but for the color of the security, this could be Uganda, this could be Kenya, this could be Ceylon, this could be Nigeria, for all we know. I mean, it is absolutely so it's very familiar for us. So, rights can be granted in constitutions, they can be written out in constitutions, but the implementation and the grabbing of them and exercising them is up to the people to do so. And of course, yes, leadership matters in the sense that if leadership is open to exercising of rights, if leadership is open to people coming out and standing up, then it will happen. I mean, look, it's still very much, I mean, any African will tell you today that what you see, even with the tear gas that was launched in DC and other places and rubber bullets and stuff, it still is a lot more safer to protest in the US than to protest in Uganda, for example, or protest in Kenya. I mean, it's as bad as it is a bit safer. It's not the same as protesting in Sweden, okay, or protesting in Norway or Finland, but it's still better than many countries that we have got. So it's we have to claim our rights. Our rights can be on paper. That doesn't mean anything. It's got to be us claiming them and exercising those rights. Otherwise, and this is a consistent struggle. When leaders are anti-people, when leaders are insecure, when leaders are dictatorial and they're not sure what they're doing, then brutality is their go-to option. And I think that's what you're seeing. So yes, indeed, leadership counts like crazy. It's very, very important. So
I mean, the protest is important, and as Rashad was just saying, the protests aren't just about George Floyd. There's been a lot that is, and you just said the original sin, 400 years and counting had brought us to this moment. How do you ensure that the protest continues to be meaningful, impactful, past this moment, and bring about change, and that the real work is done? Because we have seen the protests before, right? We are locked. It feels in some ways, the moment feels different, but we have at the same time seen the cycle before. How do we ensure that this has a different end game or a different result?
True. I think a number of things. One is continuous organization and mobilization of people. This is a moment right now. It may last another 2 weeks. It may last 1 month. It may last a day. We don't know. But it depends a lot on organizing, people organizing and keeping the groups together and ready and mobilized, ready to come out again. So that, and then that's one thing. So keep that going and figure out a way in which you can sustain this protest, whether it's going to be occupies, where you sit down and you sit and wait for a week, and there's many examples across the world, from Ukraine, where people just took over a square and sat there for a month in the winter in Ukraine. I mean, look, Ukraine, Kiev winter is not like LA winter or Atlanta winter. Kiev winter is winter, it's minus, and people sat there for more than a month until they got the change they wanted. So you've got to be persistent, you've got to be resistant, but you've got to be organized, and you've got to be ready to keep that organization and those organizations across the country mobilized and ready. 1. 2, voting. People have to get out to vote in this country, and there's young people I'm seeing have to vote. They have to vote, and not just the presidency. This is the mayoral seats, it's the district attorneys, it's the state attorneys, it's at every single level, the council. Who are you electing? Police in this country are hired by the mayors. And so you've got to get a good mayor to hire good people, get a good police chief who can then get a process of change. When I was here in 2016, the city that I found was very much advanced at that time in terms of police, community policing, and relationship with the community was in Jackson, Mississippi.
Interesting.
And that was fantastic. I found that fascinating. It was the police chief then who was about to retire was a black man whose name escapes me now. It's I keep forgetting names these days, but he was a fantastic guy. But sitting there, I talked to elders in the churches, I talked to young people, to community groups, and they all said, look, we've got a good police force. They're helpful. They don't beat us. They don't do bad things to us. That was fascinating, in that sense that you can actually create that change. DC police, the Metropolitan Police in DC, had moved a long way from where it had been 5 years ago by the time I came in 2016. And again, that was part of that process of making the police much more part of the community. So it is important to do that. So those two things have to go. And even if, I'm telling this to as many Americans as I can find, even if there's political change of the presidency in November, please do not demobilize these organizations, these organized groups. They need to be intact. They need to come out. They need to light fires for the democratic people that are there, whether it's Biden, whoever else there. They've got to be organized. That if you don't do that, then politicians easily get into a cycle of comfort, and they start doing things as they've been doing, and it's buddy things, and they move on and they're happy. So you've got to keep that fire on the politicians right through, from at the local level right up to the presidency. Look, it's one of the things that I've loved about this time here is getting all the comments and seeing the anger even in Africa. You know, the outrage in Africa, the amount of communication I get from my friends, from people who are all over, and it's people are angry in Africa.
Yes.
And a lot of this, okay, a lot of this is on WhatsApp and on Twitter and stuff. And so it's people who are basically educated. So, but the challenge for me is keep saying, look, I like your anger. I like your anger about the US. Can you also have the same anger in your own country? Can you also face up to the brutalities happening around Corona in Kenya, in Uganda, in Nigeria? Yes, we've got it. And we can do it both. We can do both. We can, we Africans, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We've done it before. And we can do it again. So we got to be able to channel our angers across the world where people of color are affected, where people like us are affected. And that's the only way this world will become better. And I like this momentum. I like this solidarity existing where Africans and the AU, the president of Ghana is commenting about the US. That's great. It shouldn't just be a one-way street. We can also comment on the US. It can't always be the reverse. The US is commenting on us. We have brains. We can say we have rights. And we can use them to say, this is not right, this is wrong. So I think that's been a great step to see that African leaders at some point are saying, we have the moral authority to say you're not obeying your own laws, you're not obeying human rights standards and human rights law, and that this needs to change. That's great in that sense.
Okay, it's so great to have you on the show and to get your insights. I hope you'll come back again soon also to keep this conversation going, because in the next conversation, I do want to talk to you about the importance of coalition and allies and the role of white people in protest when we're fighting for Black rights. So I hope we can get you back soon to talk about.
I would love to be. I would like to do this. This is a privilege to be on the same show as Isha Sesay. This is for us Africans. This is it. You have reached.
No, I hope there's more. Keep going up. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. All right.
Please take care. Well, I hope you got a lot out of those conversations, necessary conversations for this moment that we're living in. We'll be back with another live show on Monday, same time, same place. I do hope you can join us. Until then, be safe, everyone. Bye for now.